In every corner of Europe, from the mist-laden forests of Germany to the isolated villages of Scotland, the words witch and magic once carried a heavy weight. Witch hunts, far from being isolated events, were widespread campaigns of fear and persecution aimed at individuals, often women, accused of practicing harmful sorcery. Folk magic, on the other hand, referred to a collection of everyday practices rooted in ancient traditions, a blend of healing, divination, and protective rituals that people turned to for comfort in a precarious world. These two concepts, witch hunts and folk magic, are bound together by history. The same practices once seen as helpful and protective were later condemned as dangerous, unholy, and deserving of punishment. This tension did not emerge in a vacuum. Across centuries, fear of the unknown, social unrest, and the shifting power of religious authorities all converged to transform simple charms and herbal remedies into evidence of diabolic pacts. The story of witch hunts is not merely a tale of superstition, but one of control, scapegoating, and the dangers of moral panic. By tracing the evolution of folk magic from a respected local tradition to a persecuted crime, we uncover the darker side of Europe's past, the paranoia that turned neighbors into informants and healers into heretics. Long before Christianity spread across Europe, magic and sorcery occupied a complicated but respected place in society. In the ancient Near East, Egypt, and pre-Christian Europe, spells, amulets, and rituals were woven into the fabric of everyday life. Farmers relied on charms to protect their crops from blight. Travelers carried talismans to ensure safe passage, and rulers employed seers and diviners to predict the outcome of battles. In these early contexts, magic was not a sign of rebellion against divine authority. It was an accepted, even sacred way to interact with unseen forces. The roots of folk magic lay in the pagan traditions of local communities. Villagers turned to wise women, cunning men, or shamans for remedies against illness, advice about marriage, and protection against misfortune. These figures combined herbal knowledge with prayers, incantations, and rituals passed down through generations. Far from being considered dangerous, they were seen as pillars of communal health and stability. In a world where disease, famine, and war were ever-present threats, the ability to heal or ward off harm was a valued skill. Even as new religions emerged, folk magic maintained its place as a neutral or positive practice. It was neither wholly religious nor wholly secular, but occupied a gray space between the two. A charm might invoke local spirits, or, later, saints and angels, depending on the community's beliefs. This adaptability allowed folk magic to endure for centuries, but it also laid the groundwork for its later demonization. As Christianity spread and consolidated power, practices once viewed as harmless or beneficial began to appear suspicious to church authorities, eager to draw a clear line between the sacred and the profane. The slow transformation of Europe from a patchwork of pagan cultures to a Christianized continent fundamentally altered how people perceived magic. What had once been a neutral or even sacred act became a mark of suspicion. The early church, at first, tolerated or even absorbed certain folk customs, blessing wells or adopting local festivals into the Christian calendar to ease conversion. But, as the institutional power of Christianity grew, so too did the desire to stamp out practices that blurred the line between orthodox faith and superstition. This shift was not immediate, but it was profound, and over the course of centuries the image of the healer, charm maker, or wise woman morphed into that of the witch. By the early Middle Ages, church leaders had begun to issue laws and decrees explicitly warning against sorcery and heresy. The Canon Episcopi, a church text from the 10th century, famously condemned women who claimed to fly at night with pagan goddesses, asserting that such journeys were illusions planted by the devil. This was not yet a call for mass persecution, but it was a clear sign of a changing worldview. Folk practices were no longer quaint or benign. They were suspect, potentially diabolical. As Christianity emphasized a strict binary between God and Satan, the ambiguity of folk magic left it vulnerable to accusations of being on the wrong side of that divide. At the same time, political and social tensions deepened the fear surrounding unorthodox practices. The Middle Ages were marked by recurring plagues, famines, and wars, each bringing a wave of uncertainty and panic. In moments of crisis, communities searched for scapegoats. Those who were different, whether due to gender, occupation, or reputation, were easy targets. Local healers or charm makers, once relied upon for protection, could suddenly be accused of causing the very misfortunes they were hired to prevent. In this way, the blending of religious anxieties with political and social unrest created the perfect storm for the persecution of supposed witches. The Church's shift in rhetoric during this period also played a decisive role. Heresy was no longer merely a theological disagreement, but a crime with cosmic consequences. To deviate from orthodoxy was to risk the soul not only of the individual, but of the entire community. Magic, no matter how humble or practical, could be cast as a pact with the devil. Sermons, texts, and rumors reinforced the idea that witches were not merely tricksters, but agents of Satan working to undermine Christian society. This reimagining of magic as an organized conspiratorial threat laid the groundwork for the witch hunts to come. By the late 15th century, the storm that had been gathering for centuries finally broke. Europe entered a period in which fear of witchcraft reached an unprecedented intensity. This was not a single unified campaign, but a series of regional panics and prosecutions, each fed by local conditions but sharing a common language of diabolism, heresy, and fear. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, tens of thousands of people, overwhelmingly women, were accused, interrogated, and executed for witchcraft. The witch hunts did not arise out of nowhere. They were the culmination of centuries of shifting religious ideas, political anxieties, and social tensions. But in this period, they became something far more organized, codified, and deadly than before. A crucial catalyst for this escalation was the publication of influential texts that gave the witch hunts a theoretical and theological backbone. Among the most notorious was the Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, first printed in 1487 by the inquisitors Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger. This book argued that witchcraft was not merely a personal sin, but a vast conspiracy against Christendom, a heresy so dangerous it required swift and brutal eradication. It offered detailed instructions for identifying, interrogating, and prosecuting witches, presenting itself as a manual for magistrates and clergy. Although the Malleus did not create the witch hunts, it provided a chilling template that authorities across Europe could follow, making accusations and trials more systematic and more lethal. The witch trials of this era were marked by methods that combined superstition with legal procedure. Accusations often began with rumors, an unexplained illness, a failed crop, a sudden death of livestock, then escalated under pressure from neighbors or local leaders. Once accused, the suspect was subjected to interrogations designed less to discover truth than to extract confessions. Torture, though not always used, was common and brutally effective at producing whatever admissions the authorities desired. Trials could last weeks or months, with testimonies from frightened or coerced witnesses compounding the case. Even acquittal did not necessarily bring safety. An accused person might be rearrested at the first sign of new misfortune in the village. Across Europe, certain trials became infamous for their scale and cruelty. In Germany, the Würzburg and Bamberg witch hunts of the early 17th century claimed hundreds of lives, engulfing entire towns in hysteria. In England, the Pendle witch trials of 1612 became one of the country's most notorious cases, with 12 people accused and 10 executed. Across the Atlantic in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the Salem witch trials of 1692 would later loom large in the American imagination as a symbol of moral panic. These episodes were not anomalies, but part of a larger pattern of fear and repression that crossed national boundaries. Execution methods varied by region, but all were designed to display the power of church and state over the condemned. In some areas, burning at the stake was the favored punishment, a public spectacle meant to purify the soul by fire. Elsewhere, hanging was more common, particularly in England and its colonies. In certain cases, those convicted were strangled before being burned, a grim gesture of mercy. Whatever the method, the outcome was the same: the elimination of an individual marked as dangerous, and the reinforcement of communal boundaries through violence. Amid the hysteria and brutality of the witch hunts, it is easy to forget that many accused witches were ordinary people who practiced what historians now call folk magic. These were the cunning folk, the wise women, the herbalists and charm makers who lived quietly in villages and towns, offering remedies, advice, and protection to their communities. They were healers in a world where formal medical care was rare, and their knowledge of herbs, charms, rituals, and prayers was passed down orally from generation to generation. In many cases, they were trusted members of society, consulted in times of illness, crop failure, or personal crisis. Their craft was practical, rooted in observation and experience, and aimed at improving everyday life. Folk magic encompassed a wide array of practices, often blending the spiritual and the material. A healer might prepare herbal poultices to treat wounds, brew teas to ease fevers, or create protective amulets to ward off harm. Charms and rituals could call upon saints or spirits, depending on local beliefs, and prayers or incantations were integrated into nearly every treatment. These practices were rarely meant to harm. The goal was to restore balance and provide protection against the unpredictable forces of the natural and supernatural worlds. In this sense, folk magic was a deeply human response to vulnerability, an attempt to exert some control over life's uncertainties. Yet the line between healer and witch was dangerously thin in the eyes of the public. Fear, envy, or misunderstanding could turn admiration into suspicion. A healer whose remedies failed, or who was unusually skilled at divining secrets, could quickly be labeled a witch. Communities under stress, whether from famine, disease, or political turmoil, looked for scapegoats, and cunning folk, with their secretive knowledge and unusual roles, were easy targets. What had once been a respected craft became evidence of collusion with evil, a terrifying inversion of the healer's role into that of the criminal. The social perception of these practitioners was further complicated by gender and class dynamics. Most cunning folk were women, often older and of lower economic status, occupying a liminal space in the community. They held influence through their knowledge, yet were socially vulnerable, lacking formal protection or standing. Their power, however modest, threatened rigid hierarchies, and accusations of witchcraft could serve to reassert control over those who stepped outside the expected roles of women or the poor. Despite the danger, folk magic persisted, adapting to survive. Many practitioners went underground, continuing their work in secret, or reinterpreted their craft to align more closely with Christian rituals. Some merged older pagan practices with prayers to saints, creating syncretic forms of magic that were less likely to attract suspicion. Others simply kept their knowledge in private, passing it cautiously to trusted heirs or family members. In this way, even as the witch hunts devastated communities, the traditions of folk magic endured, leaving traces that would later influence modern paganism and the contemporary revival of witchcraft. One of the most striking patterns in the history of witch hunts is the overwhelming gender imbalance. The majority of those accused and executed were women. This was not a coincidence, but the product of deeply ingrained social, economic, and cultural factors that made women particularly vulnerable to suspicion. In early modern Europe, women's roles were largely defined by domestic labor, caregiving, and the management of household economies. When a woman deviated from these expected roles, whether through outspoken behavior, knowledge of healing, or independence in business, she risked attracting attention. In a society already primed to fear the unknown, these deviations could be framed as evidence of witchcraft. Economic tensions also played a crucial role. Women, particularly widows or single women, were often economically independent or otherwise visible in ways that threatened established hierarchies. A woman who managed land, ran a shop, or successfully healed the sick could appear socially disruptive, and envy or resentment could turn into accusation. Communities under stress, facing famine, disease, or political instability, needed someone to blame, and marginalized individuals, often women, were convenient targets. The intersection of gender and economic vulnerability created a perfect storm in which accusations of witchcraft could flourish. Class dynamics compounded these risks. Wealthier women were less frequently accused, though certainly not immune, because they possessed social protection through family networks or status. The majority of those accused were poor, rural women who lived on the margins of society. Their work, particularly in folk magic or midwifery, placed them in positions of both influence and exposure, where failure or misfortune could quickly be construed as malice. In many cases, witch hunts served to reinforce social hierarchies by eliminating or subjugating those who existed outside established power structures. Religion and authority amplified these dynamics. Church officials and local magistrates often used witch hunts as instruments of control, ensuring that societal norms were maintained. By targeting women who were independent or socially marginal, these institutions reinforced a patriarchal order and asserted dominance over both spiritual and temporal life. Accusations could be manipulated for political purposes as well, removing inconvenient individuals or suppressing dissent. Witch hunts were therefore not only moral panics, but tools of power, wielded to consolidate control over communities, gender relations, and social hierarchies. The focus on women also drew upon long-standing cultural stereotypes. Ideas about female weakness, susceptibility to temptation, and inherent moral frailty were pervasive. Women were imagined as closer to nature, more emotional, and therefore more easily corrupted by the devil. These assumptions created fertile ground for accusations, blending fear, misogyny, and superstition into a toxic justification for persecution. In this way, witch hunts were not merely religious events, but social instruments, reflecting and reinforcing the inequalities and anxieties of early modern Europe. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the frenzy of the witch hunts began to subside, though the process was uneven and varied across Europe. Several intertwined factors contributed to this decline, reflecting shifts in law, religion, and intellectual thought. One key element was the evolution of legal attitudes toward evidence and trial procedure. Earlier, accusations of witchcraft were often enough to secure a conviction, particularly when accompanied by torture or coerced confessions. Over time, however, courts began to demand more rigorous standards of proof. Legal authorities grew increasingly skeptical of spectral evidence, rumors, and the testimony of neighbors, recognizing that fear and personal vendettas had often dictated earlier prosecutions. Religious changes also played a significant role. The Reformation and the subsequent confessional conflicts had initially intensified witch hunts in some regions, but by the late 17th century, many Protestant and Catholic authorities alike were reconsidering the theological basis for persecution. Some clergy began to argue that witchcraft accusations were exaggerated, that the devil did not operate in the precise mechanical ways previously imagined, or that confessions extracted under torture were inherently unreliable. In regions where Enlightenment thinking began to take hold, skepticism of superstition and a focus on rational, empirical reasoning began to challenge the assumptions that had fueled centuries of persecution. The rise of scientific reasoning and empirical investigation during the Enlightenment provided intellectual ammunition against the witch hunts. Thinkers and writers questioned long-held beliefs about magic, spirits, and diabolism, encouraging societies to distinguish natural causes from supernatural explanations. Disease, crop failures, and misfortune were increasingly understood in material, rational terms rather than as the work of witches or demons. While this shift did not immediately erase folk beliefs, it gradually undermined the legitimacy of institutional witch hunts, reducing the social and legal appetite for mass persecution. Despite the decline of formal prosecutions, folk magic itself did not disappear. Many practices went underground or adapted to new circumstances. Healers and charm makers continued their work discreetly, blending older pagan or local traditions with Christian elements, creating hybrid practices that were less likely to draw suspicion. In some cases, folk magic survived through oral traditions, passed carefully from generation to generation, maintaining a thread of continuity that would later feed the revival of neo-paganism, witchcraft, and contemporary folk healing. The decline of the hunts did not erase the knowledge or the cultural significance of these practices. It merely forced them into the shadows, where they persisted quietly alongside the rise of rationalism and scientific thought. The shadow of the witch hunts stretches far beyond the period in which they occurred, leaving an indelible mark on culture, gender dynamics, and the perception of magic. One of the most significant legacies is the shaping of modern attitudes toward superstition, fear, and the other. Communities learned, often painfully, how mass panic and scapegoating could devastate lives, destroying trust and sowing paranoia. The mechanisms of accusation, rumor, envy, misunderstanding, and social tension have echoed through history, offering a cautionary example of what can happen when fear overwhelms reason. The witch hunts illustrate not just the danger of superstition, but the human tendency to seek simple explanations for complex social and natural problems. Women, in particular, bear a symbolic and historical weight in this legacy. The disproportionate targeting of women during the hunts reinforced long-standing stereotypes of female weakness, moral susceptibility, and social danger. Yet over time, these narratives have been reclaimed and transformed. Contemporary feminist scholars and practitioners of modern witchcraft have reframed the history of the hunts as a story of resilience and hidden power. The wise women, cunning folk, and herbalists who survived in secrecy or were martyred publicly are now seen as early embodiments of women asserting knowledge, agency, and independence in a patriarchal society. The revival of witchcraft and neo-pagan practices often explicitly honors this lineage, connecting spiritual and practical practices of today with a tradition that survived centuries of persecution. The survival of folk magic, despite the systematic attempts to erase it, is another key aspect of the witch hunt's legacy. Today's charms, rituals, herbal remedies, and esoteric practices often trace their roots to the same wisdom that once marked someone as a threat. Modern neo-paganism, Wicca, and other spiritual movements frequently incorporate these ancient practices, blending them with contemporary values and social consciousness. In this way, the old practices of community healing, protection, and empowerment have been reinterpreted rather than lost, demonstrating the resilience of human creativity and belief even under extreme repression. Finally, The witch hunts serve as a historical lens through which we can examine broader patterns of moral panic, scapegoating, and the policing of social norms. The fear of the other, whether based on gender, class, ethnicity, or deviation from the dominant social order, is a theme that resonates far beyond the period of European witch trials. Studying these events offers not only a window into the past, but a mirror for contemporary societies, highlighting the consequences of unchecked fear, systemic prejudice, and the manipulation of authority for social control. The dark history of witch hunts and folk magic reminds us that human societies are capable of both cruelty and endurance, of persecution and survival, and that the knowledge, wisdom, and power of marginalized communities can persist even in the face of systematic oppression. This history, while grim, ultimately carries lessons that remain vital today. It challenges us to confront our own assumptions, question authority when it suppresses knowledge, and honor the traditions of those whose lives and practices were condemned out of fear rather than true wrongdoing. The story of witches and folk magic is not simply a story of persecution. It is a story of resilience, adaptation, and the enduring human desire to understand and influence the world around us.